Hello.
Hello there. How are y'all doing today? Welcome back to Restoration Fellowship and the Counting of the Omer. Tonight is night 37, is the start of this. So we want to just jump in. Tonight we're going to be talking about the feast. We finished the book of Hebrews last night with what turned out to be a really good study, I believe. But we're going to be talking about, again, messianic perspectives and starting with something that's very important in the great long term of things, and that is the feast of the Lord.
Yes.
So if you have a scripture, open up to Leviticus 23. We'll be starting there, but we'll be jumping around a little bit to some different concepts and things. But do you want to say the blessing? You want me to?
Go ahead.
Okay. So today is day 2 of week 6 of the counting of the Omer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitchanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al seferat haomer. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and commanded us about the counting of the Omer.
Amen.
Amen. So here we are. And this issue is really a massive one because of how important it is in the scriptural world and view of things. And one of the things that makes it so difficult to really come to terms with and to really understand is because it's not a system that we work on at all.
No.
We have a Gregorian calendar? The Greco-Roman calendar, a Gregorian calendar that's been functioning since the 500s, 600s AD, and
from before that, it was tweaked around 600 by Gregory.
So we've been, with minor tweaks here and there, we've largely been following the same calendar for a very long time. And it's not the same way that the biblical calendar functions. Again, we have this concept of midnight. We base everything, the Gregorian calendar is strictly a solar calendar. And so everything works around that, and it makes sense. And we're accustomed with the idea of adding a leap second every year, or whatever else, or a leap year, adding an extra day at the end of February.
Every 4 years.
Well, a leap second is at the end, at the New Year's. They talk about those things. They're not as publicized, and they don't notice them as much because it's just a few seconds. But there's the leap year, where they add a 29th day in February.
Yes.
So, I mean, we're accustomed to that, and it generally makes sense to us. But the biblical calendar operates a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
The biblical calendar, the end of the day and the start of the next day is sundown. We get that right out of Genesis. It was evening and it was morning, the first day, the second day, all that other kind of stuff. And it is it's a lunar calendar for the months.
Yes.
But how else does it work?
Well, obviously, the months are lunar. The years are actually according to the stars and the constellations, right? And of course, the day is the sun. So, the ancients were biblical people like Abraham, like Noah, like Moses, aware of the constellations? Sure, they were.
I mean, if they were sleeping in tents, if they were sleeping outside on the roof of their house, they didn't have the bright lights in the big city. I mean, and we also have to try to get out of what's called a modernity bias, that we assume that we're advanced and intelligent and we have all this great technology, and the people back then were just a bunch of dumb hicks who could barely light a fire.
Oh, they were much smarter than we are, I think.
Yeah, I mean, these were people who could chart the stars, could chart all of these things, and who figured out the mathematics of how so much of that stuff worked, and predictions and all of that. Of
course, they used the constellations like a clock. Mm-hmm. Okay, so when this constellation comes around again, it's the same time of year that it came around last time, right? So they're watching these constellations and where they are in the sky, and they're able to map and chart these things, and they're using it like a clock. And
so that biblical calendar is is different from what we're used to. We're not used to looking to the moon for the first day of the month. We look to a nice little piece of paper on the wall to tell us that. But, the new moon was a much more of a defined, hard date.
Yes.
Than just an arbitrary date on the calendar. The middle of the month is the full moon. Those are pretty well-defined and observable concepts. And when you look at how these things were put into place back in Genesis, on the fourth day, when he says, "Let lights in the expanse of the sky be for separating the day from the night. They will be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. They will be for lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the land." And it happened so. Then God made the two great lights, the greater light for the dominion over the day, the lesser light as well as for the stars, for the dominion over the night. God set them in the expanse of the sky to shine on the land and to have dominion over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So did you catch one of the reasons that he had for putting them there? They'll be for separating day from the night, and they will be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. So they are supposed to serve to measure the passing of time.
Right.
And the hard part is that when it talks about signs and for seasons, that it's not just, that's not talking about spring, summer, fall, and winter kind of seasons.
Yes, no.
Not at all. It's actually a much different kind of a concept, and I'm trying to get that pulled up here. But the word for signs is the word ot in Hebrew.
Ot.
And how does that one function? What is ot really talking about?
Well, I mean, it's literally a sign or a banner or a beacon, or a mark. Something that's defining, right?
To call your attention to it.
Yes. So and then of course, he's looking up. You looking at ot, or are you looking at moed?
First, I'm going to look up ot.
He's going to look up ot.
Let them be for signs, a distinguishing mark, a banner, a miraculous sign, a warning, a standard. It's something that is attention getting. It's something that is supposed to be a rally point type of a thing. It's supposed to be something that everybody can see this and come and move accordingly. Based upon this ot, this signal, is another way of translating.
Used to militaries would even use flags, right, and rally all of their soldiers to flags. You see that when you watch Civil War movies a lot, right? Well, it's the same type of thing. It's that rallying point. It's that banner. It's that, hey, we're over here, or look over here, right? That's more the sense of the ot. And so the stars and the moon and the sun are saying, hey, we have something to tell you. Look over here. We're going to tell you what time of year it is. We're going to tell you what time of the month it is. We're going to tell you what time of the day it is.
That's one thing. You brought up the Civil War and Revolutionary War type of stuff that was always so baffling to me. Whenever you see the people that are holding the banners or holding the flags or whatever else like that, what you see happen is when that person gets shot and killed and the flag starts to go down or whatever else, the person next to them, it doesn't matter who it is or what they're doing, they'll drop their weapon to pick up the flag and keep it standing straight up.
Right.
And that is so counterintuitive to how you fight a battle, but that was actually a very necessary thing. You never let your flag, your standard, your banner hit the ground, and how they'll never know where we're moving or what our movements are if someone is not holding up the flag. So first off, these things are for signs. They're signal, they're attention getters. And God even uses them for that purpose.
Yes.
That's why they look to the stars. That's why they look to those things. That's not talking astrology. That's one of the big things. Astrology is where you're trying to use those things to control and manipulate or predict your future, all that kind of stuff. But astronomy and looking to the stars and connecting what is God trying to do and what is he trying to say through that there's nothing in that. You're not trying to control or manipulate or whatever. But I mean, you saw that even in the life of Yeshua at his birth. The reason why the Magi, the wise men, came is because they were looking for a sign, and that was part of the Jewish influence on the Persian Empire. They saw that a king would be born in Judah.
From the tribe of Judah.
And so they came looking for him. Where is the one who was born King of the Jews? They knew all of that before they got there. Just based upon what the signs, the oaths in the sky were telling them. And so, anyway, it's that's how oath is used for signs. Then the next word is also a very important one, where we translate it as seasons in many things. It's the Hebrew word moed,
which is very important to our discussion today.
Yes, this one is essential.
Yes.
And it really means it is for times, but it's appointed place, appointed times. A set time and meeting, appointed place, appointed sign or signal, and it's talking about a sacred signal. A sacred season, a set feast, or appointed season. So that word moed is the one that is used in terms of the feasts of the Lord.
Right.
And these are appointed times. So basically, it's somebody is making an appointment.
Yes.
And that someone is saying, you need to be here at this time on this day to meet with me, and I'm going to give you instructions.
Right.
I mean, going back to the whole military concept, if you receive orders that the general or whatever else is calling up his subordinates, and we're going to have a planning meeting about the next day's strategy, you'd better show up. You'd better show up to that meeting to be able to find out what the orders are. And if you don't, you and your men, you and your troop or whatever else are going to have no idea what the goal is, and you're not going to know how to move in order to address the attack of the enemy that's coming. And so the appointed times, the signs and the seasons are there for that purpose. To draw people, to draw God's people together so they can receive their instructions about God's plan and his purpose.
Right. Okay. And that's just Genesis chapter 1, on the fourth day. He's looking up a translation.
Well, if there's what used to be called the Holman Christian Standard. Now it's just called the Christian Standard Bible. Well, that's different. They changed it. They at least put it in the footnote, but I thought they used to have it in the actual text itself. Wow. But that one used to translate it as they will serve as signs and for the appointed times. I think it used to say festivals.
Yeah. The
times, the signs for the festivals and for days and years. That's the copy that we have says it. So. The online version is a little different. But anyway, so I want to check one thing. There's the Holman Christian Standard, so they still have that. I wonder if it's... Yeah, there it is. They will serve as signs and for festivals. That's weird. That's the same translation.
They've changed some things.
Yes, they have.
They've changed some things. All right, but yeah, that's the same word that's used for what we call the feast days, the feast of the Lord. So let's go to Leviticus chapter 23, and let's look at the first couple of verses. It says, "Then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, these are the appointed Moedim, the appointed times, or the feast days of Adonai, of the Lord, which you are to proclaim to be holy convocations, my Moedim, or my appointed times." Okay? whose appointed times are these? Are they the appointed times of the Jews? Are they the appointed times of the Christians? Or are they the appointed times of the Lord? According to Leviticus 23, they are the appointed times of
the Lord.
The Lord.
Now they are called. Some of them are called in the Gospels and such a festival of the Jews.
Yes.
So it does use that language.
It uses that language so that people will recognize. Yes, the Jews actually do these.
Yes,
right.
And that's because they are being written. The Gospels were being written to a wider cultural audience.
Right.
And there were appointed times. There were festival days. You could hardly find a day that didn't have one for one of the gods or goddesses out there. And so they were wanting to.
No, not those.
Yeah, they did not want there to be a confusion about what this festival day or what this feast day would be. So it's not the feast day of Aphrodite. It's not the feast day of Zeus. It's the feast day of the Jews.
You need to go talk to the Jews. You want to know about these feast days that are, put forth in the Torah? You need to talk to the Jews, right?
So yeah, these are appointed times that belong to the Lord. He is the one who he's set up the calendar. That we use the Gregorian calendar, and the Bible uses God's calendar.
Right.
And he says, I'm marking certain days that I want to make a day of appointment, that I want to meet with you. And I'm going to set that date. I'm going to set the agenda for that day.
Yes.
And so, we do that same type of thing. The way I'd like to talk about it is, when we are sick or when we're not feeling well, we call the doctor, and try to make an appointment with the doctor. But we don't typically call and say, yes, I would like to make an appointment with Dr. So-and-so. I want to make it on May 27th at 11 a.m. I'm going to show up there, and the doctor had better let me in.
And better come see me.
Yeah, he'd better show up when I'm there.
Doesn't quite work that way.
Usually when we call the doctor, we call and we say, yes, I would like to make an appointment. And they look over the doctor's calendar and they say, well, it looks like we'll be able to see you sometime in the next 6 months. How about Thursday, June 17th at, is 7 a.m. too early for you? Because he likes to get done early. Okay, great. I think because he won't have another appointment for another 6 months after that one, so that's the only one we got. And if you want to see that doctor, you'd better show up there at that day, at that time that you're given. So the one that has the greater authority or whatever else, or the greater agenda,
is the doctor.
Is the one who sets the time and the date for the appointment. And humanity, we, not even the Jews, they don't control that.
No.
They don't control
No.
when that is. And we don't control when that is. And that means the church doesn't control when that is. And the church doesn't have, there was, early church history. They made a big issue about changing, the dates and certain things and not connecting it to Passover, not connecting resurrection or Easter, what came to be known as, to Passover. So they were claiming authority to change things, which no human being has the authority to change.
No. When it says, thus saith the Lord, that's it. It's in the discussion.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of like a child to a parent, right? The child may complain, the child may fuss, but when mom or dad says, that's it, this is the way it's going to be, then that's it.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's the way it's supposed to work.
So these are the days of appointment of the Lord, which you are to proclaim, because there is a command in that. Hey, so I'm setting the date, and you're supposed to announce them. You're supposed to recognize them. You're supposed to tell everybody else that this is the day that we are meeting together. Because he wants all of his people there on those days. And if you fail to proclaim them, fail to recognize them, fail to keep them and guard them and observe them, then you're missing out on what the Lord wants to do and what he wants to say and what the orders that he wants to give to his people.
Right.
And that's not a good idea.
So we have the appointed times of the Lord. And then there's this term, holy convocations, right? Holy, of course, is holy. But what does he mean by convocations?
That's genius. Holy is holy.
It means set apart, right? So we have, but what about the term convocation? Right? He's got to get back to that.
Convocation
is the word
mikra.
Mikra, there you go. Mikra. And mikra means it's a convocation, a reading, a sacred assembly. It also means a rehearsal, like a dress rehearsal, right? Mm-hmm. When you're in a play and you're you're getting close to opening night, the very last night of rehearsal, you have a dress rehearsal. Make sure you do the play as if there was an audience sitting out in the seats. Right?
To make
From
sure
start to finish.
To make sure everybody knows their lines.
Yes.
Everybody knows their place, where they're supposed to be, when they're supposed to come in, when they're supposed to step out, what they're supposed to do. The dress rehearsal is to demonstrate that you know what's happening and what your role is.
That you're prepared. Mm-hmm. Right? And so these holy convocations are set apart rehearsals for something
that is something that is greater, something that God wants his people to be aware of.
Yes.
So they can know their place, their entrance, their exit, their function, their role, so that when all of these things, when the greater play is actually put on, that you'll know what's happening and what you're supposed to do in response.
Which begs the question, what is the play?
Oh, man. And,
right?
Yeah.
What is the play? What are we rehearsing for? What is the purpose of these rehearsals? What is the play?
And the play really is ultimately, it is what we would call the redemption story or the gospel.
And ultimately, opening night begins when?
Opening night begins at the arrival of Messiah.
Yes. So actually, it's the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that leads up to that kingdom,
mm-hmm.
right? Everything that led up to his first coming and the things he did in his first coming and everything leading up to his second coming and the things that will happen thereafter
mm-hmm.
in the kingdom. They're dress rehearsals for very, very important moments. And even though some of them were fulfilled in the first coming of Messiah, they still have application actually in the kingdom as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just that we're just looking back to his first coming. Even with the spring feast, we're still looking forward.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, remember in the book of Luke, when Yeshua is sitting down to that Last Supper, that Seder meal at Passover, before he is arrested and crucified, he tells his disciples, I will not eat of this meal again until it finds fulfillment in my Father's kingdom. Which means even that Passover meal is still ahead of us in our future.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So these things are not just remembering what is past, although they are very much those things. They are also dress rehearsals for what God is going to do in the future.
Very much so. And even Paul uses a language similar to that
mm-hmm.
to announce the arrival of Messiah in Galatians chapter 4, about these appointed times, these set times and things. And he says in Galatians 4:4, he says, but when the fullness of time came, God sent out his son, born of a woman, born under the law, under the Torah, to free those under the Torah so we might receive adoption as sons.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have questions about that verse, I'd recommend going back a few nights and looking at our study on Galatians that we talked about. We've already addressed a lot of that. But that language of when the fullness of time came is the same type of expectation of the arrival of the Messiah is the same kind of language that's used here of the feasts.
Yes.
That God has set certain days, God has set appointments that his people are to be aware of and participating in, so that when these things actually start to take place in the actual telling of, or the actual enacting of the story of our redemption, then you'll know what it is and you'll recognize it for what it is. So again, you are to proclaim and announce these to be holy convocations. They are his, or my moedim, my appointed times. And so we're supposed to proclaim them, acknowledge them, and direct people toward them. But we haven't been doing that.
No.
As the Christian church for over almost 2,000 years, we have not been acknowledging these days as holy convocations.
Right. And they very much do tell the redemptive story. You can literally tell the gospel with these feasts.
Yes, you can. Both the first and the second coming.
Exactly. So we have set aside a huge gospel track. Yeah. Actually, God's own personally written
7-point outline.
Track, right?
Actually, it's an 8-point outline. An 8-point outline to tell the gospel is what we have here in Leviticus 23. And what's interesting is the very first one that it's mentioned.
Yes.
And it's one that we've talked about before already.
Yes, we've already done the first one.
But the very first appointed time that he refers to is the Shabbat, is the Sabbath. That's Leviticus 23, verse 3 says, work, and so you're to proclaim these holy convocations, my appointed times, my moedim. Then verse 3, work may be done for 6 days, but the seventh day is a Shabbat of solemn rest, a holy convocation, a dress rehearsal. You know, this is the weekly rehearsal.
Yes.
You are to do no work. It is a Shabbat to Adonai in all of your dwellings.
And it is a dress rehearsal for the Shabbat to come that Hebrews talks about, which is the kingdom. So that weekly Shabbat is a dress rehearsal for the coming kingdom.
Yes.
All right? On a weekly basis, God wants his people. Think about this for a minute. God wants his people to, on a weekly basis, a regular basis, 52 times a year, so to speak, right? To remember the coming kingdom. To take that time to be with him and to remember what he has in store for them. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That is wonderful.
And you think back to that analogy with the doctor. I mean, how much better do you think you'd be feeling and doing if you were meeting with the doctor on a weekly basis? I mean, if you had that kind of access for your health to meet with a professional on a weekly basis, you would have all of your needs taken care of regularly.
Yes.
And so, you know, we have one that's even greater than our doctor.
Amen.
We have the creator of the universe
physician, right?
who he is calling us.
Yes.
You know, the doctor doesn't call us. I mean, many people lament the idea of house calls, you know, where you would call the doctor and he would show up at your house. Well, we don't do that anymore. But this is one where the creator of the universe, the doctor, is calling you and saying, "Hey, I want to show up and meet with you." God is taking a proactive approach. He's not waiting for us to call him. He is calling us.
And by the way, you don't have to pay for that doctor's visit because, you know, God's already taken care of that.
Yes, he has. So, and it's not just a, hey, I would like to meet with you.
Right.
We also need to understand that this is the king.
Amen.
The king is saying, yeah, I want to meet with you. And this is a bigger deal than, oh, well, if I feel up to it, I'll show up. We as his servants don't really have.
We don't have that sense of a king anymore.
No.
And that type of authority, right? But
we don't consider ourselves subjects. even to him.
But for most of human history, in most places in the world, that's exactly how the world functioned. There were kings, and then there were the people of the king. And when the king called, you went. Mm-hmm. There was no option. There was no option. There was no, well, let me think about it, and if I feel like it, and if I feel up to it, and if I feel all right, I'll go. No.
I'm busy.
The king called, you went.
Yeah.
The king is calling.
And he has set a time where he wants us as his people to show up.
Yes.
And we don't just go in and show up whenever we want to or whenever we feel like it. You see that even in the book of Esther.
Yes.
Where she has a major problem. I mean, her people are targeted and they're going to get killed. Mm-hmm. But she's like, I really would like to go talk to the king. I mean, he's my husband, and after all, I would really like to go talk to him. But if I show up at court without an invitation from him, it would be over.
It could cost me my life.
Yeah.
Very easily. Even
if I don't show up without his invitation, I am at his mercy and he could kill me on the spot. That's how serious of a thing it is to go before the king. You don't just show up at your own time.
And our king is a consuming fire.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, yeah, I mean, it is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God.
Of the living God, yeah.
It can be a dreadful thing because, He is God. He is the God of the universe. He is our ultimate judge. He's the one who's going to tell us either, well done, my good and faithful servant, or we've got some problems.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, we don't get to decide that.
Yeah.
In that sense. All our job is to obey the king.
Mm-hmm.
Right? To the best of our ability and the power of the Spirit, we are to obey the king.
And we have to realize that we don't have the authority to set when, where, and how that we show up before him.
Right.
None of us do. So the first of these appointed times is the Shabbat. Okay. Verse 4 says, "These are the appointed feasts of Adonai, holy convocations, which you are to proclaim in their appointed season." And they have the whole calendar system works about keeping things. The feasts that we're about to start off with, those are supposed to be in the spring, and there are certain ones that are supposed to be in the fall. There are 7 of them total. During the first month, and it's on the 14th day of the month, in the evening, is Adonai's Passover.
Right.
So the first day of the month is the new moon.
Yes.
The 14th day of the month is what? Roughly. It's the day right before the full moon.
Yes.
All right, so the full moon is in the middle of the month, about the 15th day. All right, so that's when...
You said that, though. I'm like, well, it's Passover. But yes, you're right.
So most of these feasts will coincide with the full moon. Most of them.
Either the full moon or the new moon.
Yeah. So during the first month, on the 14th day of the month, in the evening, is Adonai's Passover. On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of matzah, or unleavened bread, to Adonai. And with that one, it says, "For 7 days you are to eat matzah, and on the first day you are to have a holy convocation, and you should do no regular work. Instead, you are to present an offering made by fire to Adonai for 7 days. On the 7th day is a holy convocation, when you are to do no regular work." So these are back to back. Is Passover. The very next day starts unleavened bread, and there's supposed to be an assembly.
Yes.
And it's treated like a Sabbath day.
Well, Passover literally is the day of Passover is a preparation day. You're preparing for the Seder meal that night, right? And technically you eat it at night, which means technically you're actually eating the Passover on the 15th day.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So and of course at that meal you're having unleavened bread. So it's technically the beginning meal of unleavened bread.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but it is set apart for that day to be a day of sacrifice to, back when they had the tabernacle in the temple, and a day for preparation for that meal and the onset of unleavened bread.
Mm-hmm. So that's the first two is Passover immediately into unleavened bread. And then the third one occurs during the course of that week of unleavened bread. Within those 7 days, in verse 9 of Leviticus 23, it says, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, when you have come into the land which I give to you and reap its harvest, then you are to bring the omer of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. He is to wave the omer before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the day or the morrow after the Shabbat, the priest is to wave it. All right. So that's the Feast of First Fruits.
Yes.
Okay.
The first fruit of that barley harvest. And we're going through these kind of quick because we're just kind of introducing the spring feast tonight, and then we are going to go back starting tomorrow night, and we're going to slow it down. We're going to look at Passover, right? We're going to look at unleavened bread. We're going to look at first fruits to Shavuot a little bit closer. So we're going to slow it down. So yeah, right now all he's kind of doing is reading through Leviticus 23 to give us an idea of the spring feast that we'll go through first.
Right. Verse 15, once you recognize the Feast of First Fruits is during the course of that week of unleavened bread, and it's the day after the Sabbath. And I know that there was some debate about how that was conducted in Yeshua's day. There was some disagreement, but the ones who were in control of that were the ones in control of the temple.
Right.
They set the calendar for the temple,
right.
And so they would start unleavened bread. There was the weekly Sabbath, and the day after the weekly Sabbath was the Feast of First Fruits.
And we discussed that our very first night.
Was it the first or second night?
Well, we discussed first fruits, but we discussed the
calendar.
Differences on understanding the timing and things like that. Our very first night of the Omer count, if you want to go back and look at that.
And you'll have to forgive us for the camera
It's bad camera angle.
Because we hadn't figured out how to get the camera to look right yet. So those first couple of them are not the best. But, so there's Passover, unleavened bread, and then Feast of First Fruits. And then there's, verse 15 says, Then you were to count from the morrow after the Shabbat, from the day that you brought the omer of the wave offering, 7 complete Shabbatot, 7 complete Sabbaths. So 7 times 7 is 49. Until the morrow after the 7th Shabbat, you are to count then the 50 days, and then present a new grain offering to the Lord. We are in the middle of that.
Yes.
Right now.
That is actually what we're doing. When we do the Omer count, that's what we're doing.
Yes.
We're counting. And you'll notice that we're counting the day and the week. Right? It's day 37 starting tonight, but it was what? Day 2 of week 6. Right?
So this is the time between the Feast of First Fruits and what in traditional Christian circles is called Pentecost for 50.
Yes.
There's 7 Sabbaths, and then the day after that is the 50th day. So we are on day 37, and this is all during the time when Yeshua had been raised. Because, well, we'll talk about this a little bit, but the connection on First Fruits is that the day of Yeshua's resurrection is the Feast of First Fruits, and we'll get into more of that later.
Yes.
But so after he is raised, then how long does he stay hanging around talking to people and teaching and showing them things?
40 days.
So, yeah, he's there for 40 days on earth before his ascension. And so that means there's 10 days left of the counting of the Omer. So we know that after 40 days, they've been counting the Omer all of those times, and then he ascends on the 40th day. They have 10 more days of the counting of the Omer before the Feast of Shavuot, which is called the Feast of Weeks, or what we typically call Pentecost. And we're coming up on that. That's going to be at the end of this month, May 31st, isn't it?
Yes.
May 31st is Pentecost. or what should be typically called on the biblical calendar the Feast of Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. And so we're on the 37th day of the counting of the Omer. And so we're doing what he says to do in Leviticus 23, and this is our form of an offering.
Yes.
For that, to try to give this messianic perspective of things. So, what's next? I'm not reading everything that's in here.
Right. And then, of course, we have Shavuot, and that takes us through the spring feast. So, tomorrow night, we're going to come back, and we're going to pull the camera back, right? And take a look specifically at Passover. Mm-hmm. Or should I say, take the camera in. We're going to go in and look a little closer at Passover and talk a little bit about that.
But big picture wise, what do these spring feasts, and when we mentioned that the feasts tell the gospel.
Yes, his first coming.
Yeah. So the spring feasts, which is Passover, unleavened bread, Feast of First Fruits, and the Feast of Weeks.
Yes.
They all tell the first coming of the Messiah, and he fulfills all of these to the day.
Right.
He is crucified and offered on Passover. It's during, leading right into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where the sin is being removed. Mm-hmm. And he is raised 3 days later on the Feast of First Fruits. Mm-hmm. And then what happens 50 days later?
Pentecost, the Holy Spirit comes.
The coming of the Holy Spirit. So yes. We, on our calendar, on the traditional modern calendar, we try to make those fixed days of, okay, it happened on this Sunday, and then that makes the day of Pentecost this Sunday, right. And we try to fix it that way. But what you'll see on the Jewish calendar is that the day will float. Those days will float through the week. Because again, they have a different calendar system. They base the month on the new moon.
Well, that doesn't have anything to do with that. That has more to do with, whether or not they're going from the weekly Sabbath to the Sabbath.
Yes.
The first Sabbath of unleavened bread.
Yes.
That's why it'll float during the week.
Yes, but I mean, it's not necessarily a fixed day. First fruits is a fixed day.
Yes.
Yeah. But
which will get you to a fixed day in terms
of
the day of the week.
You're right. But Passover and the start of unleavened bread is not necessarily a fixed day on our calendar.
No.
That's what I was trying to get at. So it's a good thing she's around. But you'll see the start of things will float a little bit. But so we're not used to looking for those things. Again, right. Passover happens right before the full moon, and that's always going to be connected to the full moon. That's the middle of the month. And they tell the arrival, they tell the coming of the Messiah, what's called Messiah ben Joseph, the son of Joseph, the suffering servant. The
suffering servant, there you go.
Which is what the Jewish people, there was a debate in their day about, is it one Messiah who comes twice, or is it two separate Messiahs? Because they see the different descriptions of the Messiah who suffers and dies for sin, and they also see the Messiah who has come as the king, as the son of David, the one who sets up and establishes the kingdom.
Right.
The Jewish people even recognize those distinctions, and they were trying to understand it. Well, the feasts tell the story of the first coming is the suffering servant. And then they also tell the second coming, which is the conquering king.
Right.
And so you tell the gospel, the first and second coming of Messiah with the feasts.
Very much so.
And if you don't ever keep the feasts, if you've been taught or tradition says we have nothing to do with that, then we're missing out on a big description of the plan and purpose of God. We're missing out on the redemptive story that he's trying to tell.
Yes.
And so we don't really understand what God is doing. And then because we don't keep the feasts, because we don't look at those, not just study them, but keep them. And if we don't do that with the fall feasts, what are we not going to fully understand either? We're going to have a diminished knowledge and understanding of the second coming. And we're not going to know what to look for. We're going to have a less idea of what to look for. We're going to have a less idea of what should we be doing leading up to that.
Right. We're
going to have a less idea of how do we respond when we see these things happen, because we haven't been going to the dress rehearsals. Right? That's a nightmare of mine. I mean, I was in the marching band and all that stuff. My nightmare that I always have, one of those anxiety dreams, is showing up and I'm supposed to be, at a halftime show, or we're supposed to be doing a marching performance and such, and I don't have my instrument, I don't know the music, and I don't know where I'm going. And so I'm having to kind of weave in and out of the traffic, so to speak, in the marching band, and I have no clue where I'm going. That's one of my...
That's a really good description.
Yes, the feasts are all just big one marching band show. And you got to know what your instrument is, and you better know what the drill is, otherwise you're going to crash. But that's one of my anxiety dreams. And that's that would be the case if I never went to practice. After school, you'd be practicing the music during the day. After school, you'd show up and work on the drill. But can you imagine showing up to a show and having never been to practice? Oh, that's a nightmare. That's just awful.
See, I have dreams about tests that way. Like I show up, for my English final, having not been to class all semester.
Not having studied. It's like, okay, what's this test covering again? But that's essentially what's the case. When we see these things of God happening, if you've never taken or studied and prepared for the test, if you've never gone to practice, then you're going to be a lot more anxious about what's happening. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to be able to recognize what's happening, and you're not going to know what you should do. So studying and keeping the feasts is actually, should help us be more aware of the things that are happening in this world right now, more aware of the timing of the coming of Messiah. That's not saying we know the day or the hour.
No. But
we should not be in the dark. I mean, that's let me flip over there to that. This is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And notice the language that he uses. Concerning the times and the seasons.
Gee, I wonder what he's talking about.
And how was Moed, how was the appointed time translated back in Genesis usually?
Seasons.
It's usually translated seasons. Mm-hmm. So Paul here is using the language of the feasts and the appointed times.
Right.
Now, concerning the times and the appointed times, or the appointed feasts, brothers and sisters, you have no need for anything to be written to you. Now, why would they have no need to have anything written? Maybe because they're going to the dress rehearsals.
Right.
Maybe because they're participating in keeping the feast. And so on a yearly basis, they're being reminded of what these things mean and what they point to. He says, for you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord comes like a thief in the night, when they are saying peace and safety, shalom and safety, sudden destruction comes upon them like a woman having birth pains in the womb, and there is no way they will escape. But notice what he says here. Verse 4 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, he says, but you, brothers and sisters, are not in the dark, so that the day might overtake you like a thief. And what does that mean?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's not supposed to take them by surprise.
Yeah.
Right? For the believing community, it's not supposed to come like a thief in the night. We're supposed to be completely aware, right? It's again, that dress rehearsal type mentality.
Of preparation.
And the people behind the curtain know exactly when the curtain's supposed to open. The people on the other side of the curtain, the audience, have no clue. Mm-hmm. But the people behind the curtain who are going to be in the show
are excited about the curtain going up.
Excited about the curtain going up. Know exactly when that's going to happen. Know exactly what's going to take place when it does. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's who we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be the people behind the curtain who know exactly what's going on, because we've been to the rehearsals. Mm-hmm. We've been prepared. God has told us, right? What does Yeshua tell the disciples in John 17? I no longer call you servants, but friends, because
I don't remember the passage. Right?
Because basically, I have told you I've told you my plans. Mm-hmm. I've let you in on things that the rest of the world doesn't know about.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Therefore, you are my friends. Right? And not just my servants.
Yeah.
You know, a master and a servant, the servant doesn't even necessarily know what the master necessarily wants to do. But a friend is someone who comes alongside and knows what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So the day is not supposed to overtake us like a thief. We're not supposed to be completely clueless and have no idea what's going on. He says, verse 5, "For you are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night or of the darkness. So then let us not sleep as the others do, but let us remain on the alert and sober-minded." We're not supposed to be in a panic. We're not supposed to be, freaked out. We're not supposed to be asleep and drunk, essentially else. Like we're just completely oblivious to what's going on.
Like drunk on fear.
Yeah.
Right? The fear level that this virus and the lockdown has caused has just been astounding.
And so the more that we study and participate and keep the feasts, the greater understanding we're going to have of not just his first coming, which it does tell us about, but also his second coming. And that is what we should be doing. We have been neglecting that element of our preparation. The true preppers should be the ones who are keeping the feasts. That's the true preparation for the second coming of Messiah, for the tribulation period and all this other kind of stuff. Regardless of what your opinion is about it, the true preppers should be the ones that are studying the feast and what they mean and what they symbolize and how they do not keep us in the dark. That's what opens our eyes, the people of God, to the plan, the purpose, and the redemption of the Father.
Right. There you go.
And so we need that. And so that's one reason why we're talking about the calendar. That's one reason why we're talking about the feasts and the importance of them. And if these are new concepts to you, if you've never heard us, you might have heard of Passover, you might have heard of the Day of Atonement or something else like that, but you've not really studied them. Again, know that that's something that we have missed. That's something that we didn't grow up with.
No.
That's something that has really only come back to the believing, the church community, in the last few decades. As more Jewish people have come to faith in Messiah, they're bringing with them this knowledge,
these riches,
this depth of the feast that they may have been keeping their whole life, or they may have been studying, because that's the feast of the Jews is how we've typically understood them. So that's not for us. We don't need any of that stuff. That's all done away with. That's the deception that we have inherited. But they're coming back and they've been keeping these things. Now that they know Messiah, they're like, oh my goodness, all these things suddenly make sense because they're all about Messiah. And so they're bringing this knowledge and this excitement about Messiah in through keeping and understanding the feasts. And so we need that. We need to be keeping and following the feasts. And in fact, the feasts even help us to keep track of the Gospel of John, for example.
Oh yes.
The Gospel of John is structured around the feast. It's called, the Gospel of John is called the description of his Judean ministry. Well, if you don't pay attention to the feast, you never know why he's in Judea in the first place. Well, lo and behold, he goes to Jerusalem
for the feasts.
That's why he's there.
And he uses those feasts to describe himself.
Yeah. He talks about himself. He talks about what he's doing in light of what particular feast he happens to be at.
Yes.
And so the Gospel of John is focused primarily on the spring feasts, because that's his first coming. Well, guess what the book of Revelation is about? The book of Revelation is in a lot of ways structured around the fall feasts, which are about the second coming. And so if you never study the feasts, then you're missing a big chunk out of the book of Revelation, and no wonder it doesn't make sense to us, because we're missing a lot of the foundation of what it's built upon. So, with all of that,
good stuff, y'all. Good stuff is ahead.
Yes.
Right.
Again, tomorrow night we're going to be focusing in a good bit more on Passover.
Yes.
And looking into that. So just encourage you to come back. Be sure and share these videos with anybody you want to. Share them on your timeline and such. Write any comments or questions so that we can have some feedback, or we can address anything that might be a little confusing. Also, just visit our website, www.restorationmessiah.com. We're going to have all of these posted on the website to YouTube links and such, where you can go back and review. We just, like I said, really got done with a good teaching through the book of Hebrews that I'd recommend you going back on. But we've also addressed Galatians and Romans,
yes.
And other issues along the way.
Ephesians.
So encourage you with all of those. And just if you're here in East Tennessee, we'd love to have you come visit us some Shabbat. We should be meeting together again at the facility at First Baptist Church in Morristown on May 30th. All things going as planned anyway. So we will hopefully see y'all then. And other than that, anything else you wanted to add?
That's about it.
Okay. Well, may the Lord bless y'all and keep you. May He give you a good night and a good week. Is the Shavua Tov is the statement with that. But we look forward to seeing y'all again. Y'all have a good night.
Shalom.
Shalom.